Opening the center immediately sets the stage for an active game and fights for crucial central squares. Challenging white's central control immediately, this Sicilian counters with aggressive pawn structure, aiming for dynamic play. Developing a knight now stakes a claim in the center and prepares for pawn advances, setting a dynamic tone. Developing a knight to its natural square immediately contests central influence and prepares for queenside expansion. Puncturing the center with this pawn thrust immediately challenges black's pawn chain and opens lines for the queenside pieces. Opening the center for a dynamic game, this capture immediately challenges white's central control. Centralizing the knight establishes immediate pressure and opens avenues for further development. Developing the knight here challenges white's central pawn and prepares to castle, a sound positional step. Establishing central influence and preparing for further pawn advances or piece development while maintaining flexibility. Solidifying the center's pawn structure while preparing to develop the queen's bishop is a sound response to white's aggressive setup. Unleashing a knight towards the queen and b7 square immediately creates tactical pressure and disrupts black's comfortable setup. Securing the central pawn allows black to solidify the kingside defense and prepare for a more active middle game. Unleashing a bishop to gaze at the f7 square, this move seeks to exploit potential weaknesses around black's king. Challenging the knight's central presence, this move aggressively contests the center and opens diagonals. Sharpening the attack, this bishop redeployment aims to disrupt black's pawn structure and create immediate tactical possibilities by targeting the f6 knight. Forcefully challenging the knight's central outpost creates immediate imbalance and potential tactical fireworks. Retreating the knight to the rim forfeits central control, potentially allowing black to dominate the d5 square and build a strong pawn center. Expanding on the queenside dramatically, this pawn push aims to displace the knight and gain crucial territory, though it creates potential weaknesses. Securing the outpost on d5 disrupts black's central control and pressures the queenside pawns. Developing the bishop to a natural square solidifies the center and prepares for castling, a sensible response to white's knight maneuver. Sacrificing the bishop opens a crucial diagonal, aiming to disrupt black's pawn structure and pressure their queen. Reclaiming the bishop solidifies the pawn structure, but relinquishes control of the d5 square for now. Solidifying the center, white prepares to develop the queen's bishop and potentially launch a kingside attack. Securing the monarch is paramount. This castling ensures safety from immediate tactical incursions and prepares for central maneuvering. A seemingly passive repositioning, this knight seeks a more active diagonal, potentially targeting weaknesses on the queenside or preparing a kingside advance. Securing the rook on a relatively open file, preparing for potential pawn advances or future defensive duties on that flank. Solidifying the queenside pawn structure, this move prevents any immediate queenside expansion by black. Steering the knight towards the kingside offers better control and a potential outpost. The knight boldly ventures into enemy territory, probing for weaknesses and aiming to disrupt black's queenside harmony. Recapturing the knight frees the d-file for future action and simplifies the position, aiming for a more balanced middle game. Recapturing the knight unwinds white's pawn structure, creating outposts for black's pieces and opening the b-file. Solidifying the bishop's outpost and preparing to contest the central files, this repositioning looks to outmaneuver white's cramped knight. Developing the bishop to this square subtly prepares to challenge black's control of the a6 f1 diagonal, potentially forcing exchanges and simplifying the position. Black disrupts white's central pawn structure and eyes the d4 square, potentially opening lines for future play. Securing the king's safety before launching any further offensive maneuvers is a prudent step, setting the stage for more dynamic play. Black's queen now eyes the d4 square, aiming to disrupt white's pawn structure and perhaps create attacking chances on the queenside. This queen repositioning aims to centralize and connect your rooks, preparing for a potential breakthrough on the kingside. Opening the c-file with the rook now pressures white's queenside pawn structure and prepares for potential piece activity along that crucial corridor. Reinforcing the d-file opens avenues for future pressure and prepares for potential breakthroughs, aiming to seize initiative. Solidifying the kingside pawn structure, g6 prepares to develop the bishop but potentially weakens dark squares long-term. Shifting queen's gaze to the kingside, preparing for an eventual pawn storm or tactical breakthrough against the enemy monarch. Shifting the queen to a more defensive posture on the back rank abandons central influence and suggests a passive outlook. Securing the queenside expansion with b4 creates important space and discourages black's potential queenside activity. Challenging the queenside structure, black initiates a pawn race, aiming to create dynamic counterplay on that flank while white solidifies. Shifting the rook to the second rank prepares for potential action on the open c-file or supports a kingside advance later. A bold attempt to dislodge white's king, but it weakens black's kingside structure, potentially creating targets for white's pieces. Securing the second rank, white prepares to contest the open c-file, anticipating black's queenside expansion. Breaching the kingside pawn chain initiates immediate tactical complications and potentially weakens the monarch's shelter. Repositioning the queen to pressure the queenside pawn advances and coordinate with the rook. Prioritizing king safety, black attempts to shelter their monarch from the open files and potential piece activity by maneuvering it to a more secure square. White initiates a pawn sacrifice to open lines and gains central space for the pieces. Breaching the queenside pawn structure creates immediate dynamic play and potential weaknesses. Opening the file offers a clear avenue for the rook's activity. Capturing the pawn creates immediate pawn structure imbalances, potentially opening lines for your queen but weakening your kingside. Opening the c-file now targets black's isolated queen's pawn and creates crucial dynamic imbalances. The rook repositions, creating an immediate open file but also opening up the g-file for white's pieces. Reclaiming the queen opens up the c-file, preparing to put pressure on black's weakened queenside. That pawn thrust ignites a dangerous queenside attack, aiming to exploit the open file and pressure white's king. Opening the g-file signals an immediate assault on black's exposed monarch. Shifting focus from the queenside, black seeks to activate their queen for central influence or to support potential pawn advances. Unlocking the queenside by creating an escape square for the rook, while aiming to disrupt black's pawn structure. Seeking to blockade the open c-file, this retreat aims to neutralize white's pressure and potentially redeploy the bishop. Targeting the seventh rank and potentially exposing the black king provides immediate initiative. Shifting the rook to b7 solidifies control of the seventh rank and prepares for potential incursions along that important open file. Concentrating pressure on the now weakened queenside pawn structure after the recent exchange. A prudent retreat, safeguarding the rook from immediate threats and preparing for a potential repositioning. A strategic retreat, the bishop repositions to defend the king and prepare for potential pawn storms. Opening a vital file for the rook might prove double-edged, potentially weakening the kingside pawn shield. A bold exchange, opening up the queen's rook file and simplifying the position in hopes of exploiting the slightly weakened pawn structure. Exchanging the bishop solidifies black's central pawn structure, paving the way for improved knight mobility and a potential endgame advantage. Initiating rook activity on the open file now secures an important positional advantage. Seeking shelter for the rook on an open file, aiming to activate dormant pieces. Solidifying the pawn chain, white subtly aims to restrict black's piece mobility. Reactivating the bishop along the central diagonal offers active play and potential for harassment. Repositioning the king to a safer square, it aims to support the pawn structure and potentially participate in the endgame. Exchanging this bishop frees up the dark squares and attempts to neutralize white's queenside pressure. Opening the e-file creates immediate pressure on black's isolated pawn and enhances attacking prospects. The bishop finds a nice outpost, eyeing the weakened kingside after the exchange. Shifting the monarch to the center offers central control and preparation for potential pawn advances. Initiating an assault on the queenside, forcing white's pieces to react to the encroaching pawn storm and the open rook file. Unleashing the bishop opens lines towards black's weakened kingside. A bold king hunt, the black monarch boldly ventures forth, aiming to disrupt white's now exposed royal. King's centralization now becomes paramount after that forced pawn exchange and sacrifice, seeking to secure the monarch. The king is forced further into the open, offering immediate tactical possibilities. The king ventures out, seeking support to counter black's relentless pawn advances and bishop pressure. Capturing the bishop with the rook creates immediate activity and puts pressure on white's weakened kingside pawns. The rook redeploys to the wing, eyeing potential breakthroughs on the kingside. The rook's activation down the open file creates immediate counterplay against white's exposed king. Seizing the open file with the rook, aiming to disrupt black's pawn structure and create mating threats. The black king's exposed position now becomes a tactical liability following this check. Instinctively grabbing the advanced rook, a desperate attempt to avoid concession of the d-file. Black's bishop sacrifices its mobility, seeking to exchange itself for white's active rook and simplify into a potentially better endgame. Activating the bishop to a central square can create better coordination for a future pawn push. Reinvigorating the rook's scope, this maneuver actively contests the open file and seeks to exploit the exposed white king. Unlocking the light-squared bishop's potential to influence the kingside is paramount now. Suddenly, a final surge to exploit the exposed king, aiming to shatter white's defensive wall. Protecting the king from further checks is paramount, but the pawn on b3 offers little counterplay now. Exploiting white's weakened kingside, this pawn push immediately challenges the bishop and creates dynamic counterplay. The rook now aggressively infiltrates the enemy position, targeting potential weaknesses. Unleashing a desperate pawn storm, black gambles on creating chaos around white's reinforced king. Unleashing an aggressive pawn storm to expose the enemy monarch. Unleashing a pawn attack, black ignites potential tactical fireworks. Unleashing the rook on the open file forces black's pieces into a passive defensive posture. Unleashing the pawn creates a dangerous pass threat, forcing the king to remain active. Unleashing the rook to exploit black's exposed king, aiming to disrupt the pawn chain and secure a decisive material advantage. The king's exposed position now becomes a major liability. Unleashing the rook to force the opposing king into a vulnerable position. The black king is suddenly exposed to devastating checks from the white bishop and rook pairing. Focusing the rook on the fifth rank exploits the exposed black king and aims to win material or force a decisive advantage. Unleashing the passed pawn's potential, black aims to disrupt white's rook and create new threats. Securing the king's escape route is paramount as the rooks become more active. Pressing the attack on white's king, this rook now targets the f-file, aiming to pry open white's defenses further. Pushing the h-pawn opens lines for your monarch and aims to disrupt black's connected passed pawns. The knight's reign of terror is over. Now the king faces direct attacks down the open file. The king's exposed position allows for this immediate material gain, ending the offensive thrust. The king's safety has evaporated, paving the way for decisive mating threats with open lines. Clearing the path for the rook to potentially exploit the now open file. Securing the king's mobility is paramount now that the passed pawn is poised to advance. King centralization initiates the endgame march, aiming to occupy the vital central squares. Black's king suddenly feels exposed navigating this open territory. Shifting the king to the d-file initiates a critical endgame phase, aiming to support the pawn push and coordinate defense. Kings march into the center to seize initiative and potentially create passed pawns.